Maybe I can start by going over the origin of the left-right dichotomy.
And then I can do the second one.
Yeah, so why don't I start with that, and then, yeah, we'll sort of go through these in a way that makes sense. Yeah, you definitely can take the second one, but then I'll handle the criticisms of that one.
All right.
All right, so let's start with where the left-right paradigm comes from, or the left-right dichotomy. It originated in the French Revolution as a distinction between those who were more supportive of the royalty and religion and those who wanted a more radical transformation of society and culture. That's the origin of the term, and it referred to how they arranged themselves in the National Assembly during the period of time prior to the events of the actual revolution. It's been a while since I read up on the French Revolution, but it's an interesting story. Anyway, so it originated as this distinction between defenders of the status quo and revolutionaries, people who wanted revolutionary change. And that usage, I guess, continued in France, although the positions associated with the two sides shifted over time. I'm not sure when we adopted this in the United States or in Britain, the Anglosphere. Probably it was sometime in the late 19th century, I think. But I'm not really sure about that. So anyway, I think that covers the origin of the terms left and right, and now let's talk about what they are today, or what they mean, because I guess I should kind of circle back and say that the point of this was to try to define these terms in a way that makes sense, right? In a way that is useful in the modern world. And I guess we're going to go through a couple of different approaches to doing that, and we will talk about whether they are useful. Okay, so let's now go on to Sowell's epistemological distinction.
Yes. So basically, his distinction has to do with how knowledge is situated with regard to how society is organized. So, in order for society to work, you have to understand how it works. You need that knowledge. So they differ on exactly where that knowledge is situated primarily. So the left, they believe in a more top-down approach. They believe that, to use terms like they believe in intellectuals or perhaps a philosopher king, people who are on the top of society who come up with these abstract political theories about social organization, and by extension, how things ought to change, how they have to tweak over time. So basically, knowledge is situated with intellectual elites at the top of society, and they know best about how society ought to run, how it ought to operate. And this is in contrast with the right, which is a more bottom-up approach to knowledge. So they reject this idea that any given individual, no matter how smart, they reject this idea that they could ever understand all of the nuances of how social organization happens for each and every individual in society. Instead, they think that knowledge is distributed out to the general population. So each and every individual person has their own. He uses the word local knowledge, which is taken from Hayek, but he's using this more generally. Each individual person, they have this local knowledge about how society ought to run, or more specifically, how or their own place in society and what they ought to do. And basically, social order manifests. What's the word? It grows out of that. I guess it's from the bottom up.
Emerges?
Emerges, yeah, I guess.
Okay. So...
Or actually, let me just say really quick, this is actually where traditions come in. I just want to bring this up because they believe that traditions are a more bottom-up approach. It's something that these are ways of behaving that are situated within the people rather than in like a political theory or something. So yeah, you can go on.
So Sowell's dichotomy is between two different intuitive views of knowledge. These are not usually explicit, but different people approach knowledge in different ways. And he thinks the left-right dichotomy is based on the ways that people approach knowledge. That the right has a kind of, it's not really a view, but an intuition about knowledge that you might say is more humble, perhaps. Like they, and that, what's the right word? Views human beings as having limited knowledge.
Yeah, it's a tragic vision, yeah.
Yeah, it's a tragic vision of human nature. And of course, the tragic vision of human nature actually goes beyond knowledge to other aspects of human nature.
Yeah, and he does expand off this too. But yeah, this is specifically just knowledge-based.
Right, and the left's vision is somewhat more utopian, which is that we have the ability to figure things out. We have the ability to see the answers ourselves as individuals, and maybe we need elites to guide us. I don't know. I think that's where it starts to fall apart for me, actually. I'm trying to phrase it. I'm trying to see if I can understand Sowell's idea of the left, that they think that human reason is sufficient to give us the answers, and also they have a lot of faith in these top-down social engineering schemes, right?
Yeah. Well, did you want to go on?
No, pick it up if you have more to say.
Okay. Well, this is actually an interesting parallel to something that happened at university in one of my classes. In one of my philosophy classes, they were talking about, we're discussing Aristotle, and they brought up the fact that he thought, I can't remember the term, it was like gods among men, do they deserve like an extra vote or something like that? So then we were discussing whether some people deserve more votes. And it was rather interesting. Like, of course, I don't think anyone like outright claimed it, but multiple people in the class who are of the more progressive stripe, they openly talked about how stupid the general populace is and how philosophers are so much more intelligent. Like, it was rather interesting.
You'll have them believing in eugenics pretty soon. And the innate inequality of humanity. Yeah, well, that's one thing about the left, as we know them today, is that they're full of inconsistencies.
Because they're against like an elite class.
And yet their view of the world requires an elite class with almost total power over everything.
Yeah.
Right? Okay, so let me just give some of my criticisms of Sowell's theory, and maybe we can circle back to some aspects of it that we didn't explain enough or whatever.
Yeah.
So the first criticism is that it doesn't fit the modern left very well. And it certainly doesn't fit the stereotypical SJW, right? Sowell's idea of the left is that they are intellectuals, right? Not necessarily everyone on the left is intellectual or is an intellectual, but that they view knowledge as coming from reason, and that people can, as individuals, we have the capacity to know the answer, get our heads around the answer, right?
Yeah.
But the modern left is not intellectual / rational at all in their approach to anything, and certainly to knowledge. But like, again, I don't know how to pin down his view of left-wing epistemology, but if you look at something like standpoint theory, or the various critiques of knowledge, the postmodernists, deconstructionism, and all that stuff, it's an attack on rationality, and they also, their own beliefs are based on emotion and moral values deep moral commitments, tribalism even, and they reject reason, science, engineering, all of those things as, Western white male constructs. And instead, they see the answers as these simplistic moral solutions, like, Marxist redistribution of wealth. Or the more modern version is getting rid of, sexism and racism and all that stuff, right?
Yeah.
So there's nothing intellectual about the modern left, and they reject, in many cases, they explicitly reject rationality. And I think Sowell's theory applies more to the liberal conservative dichotomy than it does to left versus right. I mean, obviously it fits the Keynes-Hayek dichotomy when it comes to economics. The idea that, I don't know if Keynes really believed it because his views are pretty incoherent, but the idea that has become known as Keynesianism, which is that we can model the economy with aggregate variables, and we should be tweaking these aggregate variables, and the economy needs a lot of management, and so the government should play a very active role in managing the economy and directing economic activity and so on and so forth. But it stops well short of communism, and it doesn't demand, radical redistribution of wealth or equality or anything like that. And then the Hayekian view, which is that society should limit itself to setting up the rules of the game and then allow the order to emerge within the market, right? So the Hayekian view is a more hands-off approach, and it says just define the rules of the game and then let the players play. And I think Sowell's theory of knowledge fits that, and it's relevant, but I think it applies more to a distinction between liberal humanists and conservatives or traditionalists than it does to left and right. And I don't think that traditionalist versus liberal or intellectual is the same as left and right. So what do you think about that?
I do think that there are some of the limitations that you mentioned are pretty good. Though I would say that as for like the postmodern approaches on the left, I think that they're they're contradictory. So I would say that the deconstruction, I would say that is more in line with the intellectual. However, like things like standpoint theory, which emphasize like someone's lived experience as an oppressed person, that definitely goes against it. Because I don't know, lived experience, it almost makes you think of like like local knowledge, almost. Perhaps it's not the exact same thing, but yeah.
Well, it is kind of like that, right? Like everyone has their own local knowledge. I'm not sure that's how the left uses the term, but
yeah. Like I was drawing the connection, like a loose connection.
Yeah, no, I get it, but they don't use it in any consistent way, so it's very difficult to pin down what their view actually is. And when it comes to deconstruction, well, that's intrinsically destructive, right? It doesn't give us any guidance for what to do. It's just a way of attacking the status quo.
Yes,
right? It's like saying the current beliefs about the world, the current system, all that should be attacked because it's just an instrument of oppression. But it doesn't offer us a way of selecting replacement beliefs. It just assumes that the views of the left, the kind of moral, emotional views of the left, are correct, right? So, like, it doesn't attempt to derive a replacement theory of how things should work or what the truth is, right?
Well, I could have a response to that. This is something that was mentioned in one of my classes, which was basically it was a theory of human interaction throughout history, and it was definitely like influenced by Marxist thought. So basically, it was human interaction fits into this model of dialectic. So there's the canonical and the noetic. So the canonical is basically the status quo. They have certain social norms, certain social institutions, which are, again, they're the status quo, and they're inherently exclusionary. They got to emphasize that. And they basically enforce the status quo by declaring everything that goes against it as immoral and wrong. And then this contrasts with the noetic part of the dialectic, which is the people who are excluded from this canonical side of it. I think they even use the word lived experience. Their experience reveals the fact that this canonical approach is not natural. Basically, it's an artificial system that creates like artificial categories, artificial ways of organizing, and they basically fight back against this system. So again, it's a dialectic. So there's inherent tension between the canonical and the noetic.
Right. Well, they fight back against it, but like what would they propose to replace it with, and what would that be based on?
Well, the thing is, and this is what they don't realize, is that they don't realize that we are inherently going to have like a certain system that generalizes and simplifies human interaction. There's always going to be people excluded, in other words. But in their view, and definitely in class, the people talking, like they don't even think about it. They think that I guess the progress is removing these exclusionary barriers and creating an all-inclusive society.
Right.
So that would
right.
be their goal.
Yeah, but that's kind of my point, that it isn't like the left has this belief that we need an intellectual class to guide us and we can figure it all out. Their belief is even more utopian and idealistic, which is that every problem is just caused by oppression, and if we just overthrow the system, every problem is solved. So they focus on overthrowing the status quo order, and they don't spend very much time thinking about what would replace it. And I don't think that they think about it as philosopher kings ruling over us, but more like we just need to overthrow the ruling class, and then everything will work itself out. I mean, I think
right.
I think it's like a lion. Have you seen the movie The Lion King?
Yeah.
I always think of that movie when I think of ideologies, because the plot arc is kind of like the narrative of every ideology. There's this golden age, and then some evil comes along, and people lose their rightful place in the world, and then they have to go through some trials and tribulations, and then they overthrow the evil forces, and then everything is wonderful.
Yeah.
And there's never any explanation of what makes one side bad and the other side good, or any of that stuff. And I really think that their view, like their ideological view of things, is like the Lion King, that they're the good guys fighting against the bad guys, and if they win, then the sun comes out and the flowers bloom and the rainbows, or I don't think they understand that there is any problem that needs to be solved to make a society work, because I don't think it's something that they think about.
They're more focused on getting rid of the status quo than think about where to go.
Right, and I think if they manage to do that, then the people in charge now face a very difficult problem of trying to make society work, and they do it with a bunch of ad hoc interventions. And that's where you get the sort of top-down, totalitarian, ad hoc management, the sort of bureaucratic management of everything. It comes about not as a deliberate plan, but as an inevitable consequence of overthrowing the existing regime and then struggling to bring about the utopia, which doesn't naturally emerge.
Well, one thing I could say is that when I was thinking about, say, like the philosopher king, I was actually thinking it as like the people that come up with these Marxist influenced theories. They are, the high-minded intellectuals who think that they can accurately model human interaction, and like that's where the soul's theory comes in. Like I understand what you're saying about how the theory within their theory itself, they don't rely on like a philosopher king in the name, but the people that come up with the theories, they are basically pretending that they understand, human interaction. They understand that, oh, it is a dialectic rather than something more complicated.
Yeah, well, I guess. All right, well, so that's one criticism, is that it doesn't fit the... I don't think it fits the SJWs or the revolutionaries in, say, the Russian Revolution very well, or Marxism very well. And I guess there's just one more point I want to make about it. Not that I'm trying to tear down Soul, because I think it's actually a really useful framework for thinking about a lot of things. It's a useful dichotomy.
Yeah.
The distinction between traditional knowledge that is empirical in the sense that it has been tried and tested and it exists, and having a respect for the status quo, distributed knowledge of a system, that, and also having the humility to say I might not be able to fully grasp it. So I agree with all of that, but I do think that once you get to the point of theorizing about it the way Soul does, it's kind of like becoming an atheist, but then still seeing that there are some virtues to religion, but you can't go back. So it's almost like once you become epistemologically woke, you can't go back, right? And Soul is an intellectual, right? He is theorizing about it, and he is proposing a way to get our heads around it, and he is giving us a box to fit the emergent order inside. And we have a couple of those boxes. One is the market. There is a way of encompassing it without knowing all the details, right? Yeah. Which is understanding the concept of emergence and distributed knowledge, read Hayek, etc. So I think that you kind of have to go up to the next level. Like he's at a meta level above this, being an intellectual above theorizing about intellectualism and traditionalism, and pointing out that traditionalism has some advantages. But he's doing that as an intellectual.
Yeah.
And it's only as an intellectual that you can make that case in that way, right? A traditionalist believes in their traditions just because they are their traditions, and they don't need a justification. So once you start doing that, you are an intellectual, and it's almost like you have to now take on the responsibility of an intellectual, of saying, okay, here's the system, here's how we should create our society.
Yeah. So instead of like the hoi polloi, blindly following what they've been conditioned to believe, you transcended above, and now you can no longer rely on that, right? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Okay. Once you get up to that level, it's almost like a self-defeating criticism. Like, it's a criticism of intellectualism, but it's a criticism that would apply to itself. If you make it into an absolute criticism, it would apply to itself. It would be self-negating.
Yeah. So it's just a problem with absolute. You need to cede ground, at least to some degree.
Yeah, you have to have a balance, but also ultimately, if you're going to try to consciously act into history to create the kind of society you want, the only way to do that is as an intellectual. A traditionalist simply can't do that. All they can do is react against change. They have no conceptual basis for saying things should be this way or that way, because they don't have a justification of their own knowledge. I don't want to go off on a tangent on that, but I just thought I would bring that up because it occurred to me that Soul is kind of pulling the rug out from under his own feet.
Yeah. It's just an interesting paradox almost.
Yeah, it is a kind of self-referential paradox. It's related to the liar's paradox. Because in a way he's calling himself a liar, sort of, like he's saying, I can't trust what I'm saying here because I'm being an intellectual. So,
Well,
anyway.
I mean, I guess maybe a response to that is he does define intellectual in such a way that, I mean, I don't think it's as broad and sweeping as perhaps we're treating it. It's narrower in the sense that these people, they're less humble, and I guess he wouldn't really consider like himself, even if he is somewhat close to them, he's not necessarily an intellectual as he's defining it because he has a certain humility, I guess.
Yeah, but he can't wiggle out of it that way because once he puts himself up there and says, okay, I'm looking down at both of these things, and here's why traditional knowledge is often superior. As soon as he does that, he's an intellectual, and he can't really get out of it. He can't go back. Anyway, I don't want to
Yeah.
belabor it, but I think it's just interesting to think about.
Yeah.
Okay, so we talked about Sowell's epistemological definition of left versus right. And it's interesting, but I don't think it fully captures left and right. I think it captures certain aspects, or some kind of a distinction that exists, but that isn't really the same as left versus right.
Yeah. Okay. And do we want to move on then?
Yeah. So the next thing on the list is competing moral paradigms, need-based versus merit-based. And that's something I proposed as one way to define it.
Yeah.
Well, no, maybe I should just back up a little bit and say that my view of it is still pretty much for or against the status quo. I'm still going to hold on to that definition, although I don't think it's ideal. But I think there's some other possibilities. So this is one of them, which is the left sees things as, well, the left has a need-based moral paradigm, which is that it looks for the people who have needs or who are victims. And it sees the world as, or it sees politics through this moral lens as a bunch of moral problems that involve helping those in need and justice for the oppressed.
Mm-hmm.
And they have a bunch of moral narratives that define types of oppression or categories of need. So, for example, disabled people are an example of people who aren't really victims, but the left will say, oh, look at these people, they need help, we should make their lives as good as everyone else's. So we should build ramps everywhere so that people who can't walk aren't denied access to buildings. They get the same access to services as the able-bodied, right?
Yeah.
That's an example that it's kind of fallen by the wayside in recent times, but there was a time when access for the disabled was a big thing. It wasn't like a big issue, but it was just something that the left would always push. And it's also a way of virtue signaling, right? So you can see left as a way of virtue signaling about helping the victims. So to some extent, it's insincere, but it's a moral paradigm in which moral problems are defined as some people don't have enough stuff, such as disabled people or the poor, or somebody's stomping on them, such as racism or domestic violence or something like that, colonialism, etc.
Or like something I could just quickly add would be basically a critique of the other side, the critique of the merit-based, like the existence of disabled people or perhaps differences in talents. That might be a critique of merit-based, which ties into a merit-based morality, which ties into a more need-based approach. So, disabled people, they don't fit into this meritocracy, so we need to have a moral paradigm that's based on need instead.
Mm-hmm. Well, the meritocracy, or the merit-based moral paradigm, is one in which I guess you could say that rights are earned by by having responsibilities. So to some extent, it's about balancing rights and responsibilities. And rights are not a right.
Yeah.
Rights are earned. And social benefits should be earned. And in general, a merit-based moral paradigm is one in which it's intrinsically inegalitarian, right? Because some people are going to merit more than others, presumably. Or at least it doesn't demand egalitarianism, because it sees inequalities as often being due to merit. So this person did more for his society, and so he received more. In a merit-based system, there are winners, there are losers, and life is perceived as being intrinsically competitive. Competition is not necessarily a bad thing. And individuals should strive to be worthy of receiving benefits from society, rather than demanding them solely on the basis that they exist and they have needs. Right? So I think there is that distinction between the left and the right in terms of the moral paradigms that they invoke in political discussions. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I actually think this is probably one of the more accurate. It's actually in line with something that Jonathan Haidt talks about in his The Righteous Mind, where basically one of the moral foundations is fairness and reciprocity. And in his later theory, this component was designed to capture the right's merit-based moral assumption. So basically, if you don't give your due to society, if you don't contribute, then you should be punished, essentially. And the need-based that applies to Jonathan Haidt's moral foundation of liberty and oppression, and also perhaps care harm. Those are the two main foundations that they score really high in. So the liberty and oppression would be those people that are being held down by the boot, and then the care-based would be, I guess it's kind of related, but perhaps care for people with disabilities. So I don't know, that's just something that occurred to me. Because, yeah, I do think this is very accurate.
And the left tends to view any inequality of outcomes as either due to something that is beyond the control of the person, yes, such as a disability or being born into poverty or something like that, or harm imposed on them by society.
So it's like an external locus of control rather than internal?
Well, it is for the victims, right? They always have victims. They always have people in need. And those people are always, they're never the cause of their own problems.
Yeah.
Which, kind of makes sense just from a political pragmatism perspective, that if they're demanding something on a moral basis, then the people can't be responsible for it themselves, or they can't make the demand.
Yeah.
There's an interesting book that I read a while back. I can't remember what it's called. I think it's called Moral Politics. It was by George Lakoff, who is a linguist, and who's kind of he's known for his work on metaphors. And he proposed a distinction that is like that both sides view government as kind of like a parent. Like the government or the state-individual relationship is conceptualized as a parent-child relationship. And he sees the right as preferring an authoritarian father figure. The stern father, the disciplinarian, the one who maintains the order in the household kind of thing. And the left as preferring a nurturing parent, usually a father as well. So he thinks that people vote for a father figure, and they vote either for one of these archetypes of fatherhood, the stern disciplinarian father, or the kind nurturing father who will pick you up when you fall down and put a Band-Aid on your knee and give everyone the same number of cookies, because you're all little kids, right? And I think that's kind of useful. I mean, I think that is one way to see it. And another way you could look at this is that the left's moral paradigm is the morality of the family. It's altruistic. And the right's moral paradigm is actually the morality of society, which is reciprocal.
Yeah.
Parents are altruistic toward children because, they care for their children, and that's the way the family works. You just give, right? And so if you view the state as like a parent, then you're going to have the moral intuition that it should give things to you, and that your responsibilities to it are basically nil, right?
Yeah.
Whereas if you view the state as just everybody else in the collective, and we all have responsibilities to each other, and the state is just a representative of the collective, then you have a more reciprocal attitude toward the state, right? You think you have responsibilities to it, it has responsibilities to you, but you wouldn't expect to get something for free.
Yeah. And I would say that second one, the difference between like a family-based and then a society-based, I think that works better than the first one that was by George Lakoff. Well, I can kind of understand how his conception of the right might be authoritarian, because they might have more emphasis on, say, punishment as opposed to rehabilitation. But I think that many on the right, they view themselves as small government as well, which doesn't seem to fit with the more stern father thing. Maybe like it fits in the sense that it's like you need to learn to pick yourself up, I guess. So I'm not gonna come here and baby you. But I don't know if I'd call that authoritarian though.
Well, I think each side views the other as authoritarian when it pursues its own vision of society. So the left is viewed as authoritarian when it wants to take away your guns or take away your money and give it to somebody else.
Yeah.
Right? Or tell you what to do, or tell you can't say naughty words or whatever. Although the right does that too sometimes.
Yeah.
And then the right is viewed as authoritarian for wanting to throw people in jail for some minor transgression, or saying, well, just... I think that they often view it as authoritarian even to not help those in need, or to be kind of stern and say, you have to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. We're going to take away your welfare check, that kind of thing. They view that as authoritarian, even though it's actually more libertarian than authoritarian. But the left views that as authoritarian.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think both sides view the other as authoritarian, and neither side is more so than the other.
Yeah, and this ties into something I mentioned last time, which was talking about how Ben Shapiro, who was on the right, views the left-right dichotomy, and then a more left-wing guy, I think it was David Pakman, talking about his distinction between the left and right. So just to quickly repeat that, it was David Pakman was talking about how when Marxism gets implemented, when it becomes more authoritarian, it becomes more right-wing. That was the term he used. So basically, he associated state control with the right, and then Ben Shapiro is the complete opposite. He views it as the left as authoritarian, in the sense that he always had that really weird argument, whereas against universal healthcare, whereas like, do you want to force a doctor at gunpoint to give you help or something like that? Like, it was always a really weird argument, but it was, again, basically trying to characterize them as authoritarian, as opposed to the right, which is a free market, so voluntary exchange.
Yeah. Well, I think there is something to the idea that once one side wins, it becomes the right, and the other side becomes the left. And that goes back to the status quo concept, whether you're for or against the status quo. But I think that's actually part of the next thing we were going to discuss, which is left versus right as different strategies for getting and keeping power.
Yeah.
So, do you think we've covered the moral paradigms view enough?
Yeah, I think that was fairly straightforward.
Yeah, I think we got it mostly covered. Okay. So
Yeah.
let's move on to the other one.
Yeah.
I don't know if do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. So, well, in my view, I would say that the left, they have a better means for acquiring power, and then they kind of squander when it comes to keeping power. But I do have an idea of how they justify it. So, acquiring power is pretty straightforward because they adopt that, I guess the moral paradigm about not the need-based one, but the oppressor-oppressed dichotomy. So there's like the existing status quo, which enforces certain norms, has certain social institutions which are oppressive, they marginalize and cut certain people out of the social discourse.
There will always be winners and losers, and there will always be outsiders and insiders.
Yeah.
In any society.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say is that they side with the oppressed, and they use that to justify overthrowing the status quo. So justify taking up a position of power and upsetting the whole process, I guess. So that's how they justify acquiring power. For keeping power, this is where they kind of hit, the certain paradox where it's like you represent the oppressed, but you're in the position of power. You enforce the status quo now. So, like, how do you justify this? And I think that they use identity politics to justify this. So they define power structures according to social identities, and then they have that override their how they view interactions among like individual people. So say that like there's a black woman and she's a professor. So she's in a position of power. She has influence over her students, and perhaps she's like an activist type. So she can influence these students, encourage them to get out and be activists. And so, from an individual's perspective, she is in a position of power. She is the status quo, and arguing for a certain position. Maybe status quo isn't the best word, but the point is she's in a position of power. And she's enforcing certain norms within a certain context, and but she justifies her claim to oppression by appealing to her social identity. So it's not her position as an individual that defines the power that she has. It's instead her identity. The intersection of race and gender here. So that's how they justify keeping power. They embrace a certain approach which, again, defines power structures based on social identities or some sort of collective, and then they ignore its application to individuals. And then for the right, I would say that they have the opposite problem. They don't really have a means for acquiring power. And maybe you could, like when I'm finished, you can give your ideas on this. But for keeping power, though, it's fairly straightforward. They're all about, again, enforcing the status quo, setting up a certain order to society, and basically anyone who opposes this order, they want, you could say, chaos or disorder. Just like a breakdown of a working system, a breakdown of the meritocracy that we have. And basically, everyone who differs from this norm is immoral or, entitled, something like that. And basically, that's how they justify keeping power.
Well, okay, so yeah, I have a very similar view, and but it might be a little bit different. So I think I'm just going to go through my version of this.
Okay.
I think leftism is a strategy for getting power, and power not just in the form of political power, but also like a redistribution of wealth, distribution of wealth to certain people, identities, whatever. And it's a strategy based on making moral arguments that these outsiders or marginalized people need to have more power, or they need to have more stuff, or whatever. So it's kind of like a coalition of the outsiders and the people at the bottom against the insiders and the people at the top, at least within a certain view of society. And you know, the people on the bottom might not really be on the bottom in reality. It might just be a perception. Like, you know, women might be economically on the bottom, but they have sexual power that compensates for it. Yeah. But the left says, oh, you women are being oppressed, and that makes women want to support the left, and that's how they get their power base. And the right's power base is mostly people who are already in positions of power, or kind of comfortable, like they're settled. They don't really want things to change. So the left tries to get a bunch of people together to seize power and to change the existing power structure. And that goes back to the French Revolution. The revolutionary side was the left, the conservative side was the right. So they just appeal to different factions, and that's one reason why the left-right dichotomy almost always can be applied to politics, because politics tends to become a competition between two factions. Because if you had like 5 factions, they, you know, the biggest one is going to win, so the one that is going to create a larger coalition will win, and what you end up with are usually 2 competing factions. So that's why left-right makes sense, even though the actual political positions shift a lot over time. You know, their core concerns change. And we've seen them change from economic to more being about status and sexuality and identity and stuff like that. So I think that, yeah, you can see left and right as 2 different strategies, and one is a strategy for keeping power, for maintaining the status quo by appealing to it as normative, as good, and kind of promising stability.
Yeah, it's natural.
And the other...
It's natural.
Yeah, natural. Whatever exists is going to be portrayed as natural. And, you know, it has that, to go back to Sowell's idea, it has at least empirically validated itself by existing.
Yeah.
But the left is going to have to appeal to some utopian ideology, right? Some revolutionary plan that's going to require the overthrow of the power structure, and it has to justify that on some basis. And so it can justify that by an appeal to an imaginary utopia, but also by pointing to oppression or needs that are unmet. And so I think that's the dichotomy between the 2 different political strategies. They just appeal to different subsets of the population.
Yeah.
Okay, so did you want to add anything to that or criticize that?
No, it was pretty much in line with everything I said. Just the left, they're more about acquiring power, and where they flounder is with keeping it. Though I did give my theory on how they maintain it. And then the right is the opposite.
So, like, there is a point that the left, to stay in power with a leftist ideology, they have to have a perpetual revolution. Right? They have to keep moving the goalposts because the utopia never comes, so they have to find new kinds of oppression to fight against.
Yes.
Or new unmet needs.
Yeah, well, right? I think a good example of this would be something like unconscious bias. Unconscious bias is ubiquitous. It's never going to go away, or at least there's no reason to believe it will. So there will never be a point where they can just stop pointing to it and saying, you know, look at this. We're still oppressed. We're still oppressed. Right. It's basically this unreasonable standard where they're literally going after people for something they're not even consciously thinking of. Like it's
or fat shaming, any of these silly things that, you know, the leftists of previous generations would have laughed at because they were concerned with actual hungry people or people who were poor in ways that, you know, have become very uncommon.
Yeah, well, none of
So
that stands up to like manspreading and stuff like that.
manspreading is pretty silly. Yeah, that's one of the... But I mean, there's all these silly things, but they have to come up with them because they need a power base. And so they have to tell their base that there's something wrong and we need to overthrow the power structure. And when we do, you're going to get a benefit. And the power structure doesn't even have to be just the political power structure, because these distinctions exist within cultural conflicts as well, or within institutions like the academy, right? And the left has been fighting a culture war, not just a political war over electing people, but a culture war over changing the culture on that kind of basis. And that's how they have seized power in the cultural institutions, by demanding it and by propagating this ideology that this power is necessary to remedy these huge problems, like men sitting on the subway a certain way, or women making, I don't know, whatever it is, 10% less than men because they work 10% less, or all these silly things, right? But you have to justify it. So the ideologies are selected to justify the seizure of power, and not vice versa. The seizure of power is not, like, they don't perceive the problem and then try to get the power to solve it. They want the power, and then they generate the justification for taking it, basically.
Yeah, I don't know if I take a position on like what psychologically their approach is, like whether they're looking for power first or whether they want to help people first. Like, I think it's probably a little bit of both, but either way, it doesn't really matter. Like, in practice, it amounts to the same thing. If you genuinely feel that unconscious bias is a problem, then try to occupy a position of power to fix the problem. Then it's the same effect as occupying the position of power and then using the unconscious bias to justify that.
Well, the difference is that if you really were sincerely concerned with solving the problem, then when you've solved the problem, you wouldn't feel the need to generate a new problem.
Well, I guess my point was that unconscious bias is unsolvable, so...
Yeah, but I don't even think it's a problem. I guess that's what I'm saying. I think that a lot of these issues are non-problems, or they're problems generated by a filtered view of reality that ignores other things, like ignoring the fact that men are more likely to die on the job than women, and that men work longer hours, and yada yada yada.
Well, and then like discrimination and sentencing and stuff like that. Like, they go on and on about race, but it's never about gender.
Yeah, I think it's very clearly in bad faith and selected to serve the pursuit of power. I think there are two ways in which it is serving that function. One is for people who are higher up to use this self-righteous crusade to advance their careers. And for people lower down, it's just a way to virtue signal and to claim moral superiority, which is a kind of power, right? It's a kind of social power. It's a very low-level form, but, people are obsessed with status. And so virtue signaling is like this huge thing nowadays. Yeah, I mean, well, yeah, you can see, it's like, that's what social media is. It's just this non-stop orgy of virtue signaling, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we've covered that topic fairly thoroughly.
Yeah.
And I guess now the last one is to discuss the shifting roles of left and right in the current year. I guess I've put myself in the position of having to tackle that one. Okay. Shoot.
I mean,
I should have ordered these differently.
Well, if you don't have something, I could say something, I guess.
Well, I have something. Okay, let me just take a crack at it, but it's a bit tricky. So, I think the left has won a lot in the last 20 years or so, especially in the culture war, especially in institutions, more so than electoral politics. And I think the establishment has, I think leftist ideology has become accepted belief. So it has become kind of like religious dogma. And this puts us in a strange position where the status quo is actually leftist, and the right is now on the outside, at least culturally, and to some extent in politics, but certainly the establishment likes this leftist ideology and is comfortable with it and promotes it, right?
Yeah.
And uses it to justify their power. Like, it's okay for us CEOs to make, I don't know, $500 million a year because we're fighting the good fight against sexism and racism and stuff, right? So it's kind of funny that it's almost come full circle from the Marxist class struggle to a justification for these extremes of wealth inequality and a way of like sweeping them under the carpet and saying they don't really matter. What really matters is the small wage gap between men and women, or the fact that whites make more money than blacks or whatever. So we're in a situation where the left and the right are in the process of switching roles, I think. And that's why the right is becoming more reactionary, which is the right-wing version of the revolutionary left.
Yeah.
It's the attempt to fight your way back to something that existed before, right? It's like the leftist revolutionary wants to go forward to the golden utopia or the imaginary fantasy land. The right-wing reactionary wants to go back to the golden age, the previous status quo. And then, of course, the left is now in the position of trying to defend what they have conquered, right? And possibly carry the revolution on to new ground. So I guess that's my view of the way things are right now, and that's one reason why you see this shuffling around of positions and people that, like the youth, I wouldn't say the youth is more right than left, but there is this strong right-wing reactionary youth movement that is in many ways similar to the left-wing youth movements of, say, the 1960s. Yeah, so what do you think about that summary?
That was pretty much in line with everything I was thinking. Specifically, one thing that I definitely focused in on was the reactionary right, and how they are basically two sides of the same coin with the revolutionary left. Though I guess something I could add would be thinking about, I guess, maybe the left-leaning liberals, perhaps like the Sargon of Akkad types. They don't really fit in either extreme. So, like, perhaps he was left-leaning in the past, but now, after the left has gained so much ground, he's not necessarily a reactionary, but he still wants to maybe go back a few years, or it's more, I guess you consider a right-wing position, just not like a full-on reactionary position.
Yeah, like the reactionaries want to go back to something, and it depends on what they're primarily concerned with. If it's culture, then usually they want to go back to some kind of religious status quo or golden age of the past.
Yeah.
If it's race, then they want to go back to some racial status quo or demographic status quo. Yeah, Sargon and the liberals like him, and I should probably say I don't think left-right, it doesn't describe everything. It's just one dimension of something much more complex. And yeah, I think somebody like Sargon finds himself on the right. I think you would have to say that in the current year, his position is a right-wing position, even if he thinks of it as a left-wing position.
Well, even now, I've heard him describe himself as centrist. So
yeah.
So he's recognizing that he's like, oh yeah, I'm kind of moving further to the right. Excuse me.
Yeah, I think people like Sargon are trying to fight for a status quo that is like in very recent memory.
Yeah.
This is one of the things about conservatism. It isn't based on ideology, because the conservative is fighting for what he knows intimately. He's not fighting for an imaginary utopia. He's fighting for what he sees, what he feels, what's around him, the the reality that he knows.
Yeah.
And then as he gets pulled away from, or as reality changes, he either moves along with it or he tries to fight his way back to something that existed before. Right? And I think Sargon, because he was comfortable with, say, the 90s, early noughties culture, right? Like, he's trying to fight back just to, like, 2005 or something.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like some of the reactionaries want to go back to 1482 or something. Yeah, Sargon wants to go back to, like, 2002 maybe, or something like that. You know, maybe even 2007. I don't know. So yeah, that's why he's a centrist, and that's why he's sort of on the right, but he's more like a conservative in the sense that he just wants to go back a little bit to a status quo that was left when it came into being.
So right? He's like, almost a conservative, like, if you take the conservative term literally.
Right. So he's not a reactionary, but he's a conservative in the sense that the ground has shifted under his feet a little bit, but it's in his living memory what he's fighting for.
Yeah.
Whereas for a reactionary, the ground has shifted so much that it's not even in their living memory, and they're fighting for a kind of imaginary golden age, or something that they don't even, they haven't actually experienced. Right? Now, that wouldn't apply to something like the fascists, say, in Spain, like in the Spanish Civil War, because they were fighting for something in recent memory. And I guess you could call them reactionaries. But the modern reactionary right, like, NRX, the alt-right, that kind of thing, they're reacting against modernity and the agenda, the liberal humanist / Marxist kind of combined agendas of those two movements, I guess, of the last 50 to 100 years.
Yeah.
Right? So they want to go way back, right? And that's why they are revolutionary.
Yeah, in their one way, yeah.
Yeah, and also they are more populist, right? Because they're not in the establishment. And, as the establishment becomes leftist, the common man, the working man, and so on becomes more more right-wing, I guess, yeah. But in the reactionary sense. And a lot of issues that were once on the left are now becoming right-wing issues, like being anti-war and like being pro-environmentalist, right? Because the more you see the corporations as your enemy, the more you don't have the 401k, the more you see the government as your enemy, the less you want the government to attack somebody else. So it is interesting. We've seen almost a complete flip-flop, right? I mean, now today's reactionary right is pro-Russia, anti-war, pro-environmentalist, pro-working class, and somewhat skeptical of capitalism, and certainly opposed to the big corporations. So it's very it's very similar to the left of the 1960s in a lot of ways, and it's also opposed to the dominant religion of our time, which is humanism. Like, it's heretical. It's opposed to the religious dogma that we're all supposed to repeat, and chant endlessly, right? Just in the same way that 60s radicals were heretics against Christianity and traditional sexual morality and stuff like that. Today's right reactionary right consists of heretics against the religion of our times, the religion of egalitarianism and feminism and anti-racism and all the kind of the modern sexual morality. They reject that. Like, have as much sex as you want with anybody you want, and that kind of sexual degeneracy thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's like a very clear parallel between the left of the past and the right of today.
Yeah, and this is kind of in line with something that you mentioned before, except something that you mentioned before that was three positions that were all shifting instead of two. Do you remember that? That was...
So I was using liberal, left, and right as three political positions.
Yeah.
because I was looking at it in a little more complicated way with, instead of just left versus right, it was left, right, and liberal. And I said that they sort of rotated around, they rotated their positions so that the liberals became conservatives, the right became the left, and the left became the liberals in a sense. The point was that the liberals were kind of like in power. Like the liberals were kind of in the center almost. This we probably should just leave this out because it brings in a whole other aspect of this, which, what is a liberal? And let's just
I mean, I
skip
think
that.
I think this relates more generally to, I guess, the problem of the left-right dichotomy in general. So basically, like at best, it can be an useful model or way of organizing, the giant clusterfuck of political positions that people hold. But basically, I don't think there is a perfect or an accurate way of categorizing people. We have to generalize and simplify down.
Yeah, it certainly does not cover all of the complexity of political positions, whether it's ideologies or practical political positions. But I think it's useful to have as a way of looking at things, and I think it's useful to have these different views.
Yeah, this kind of relates to how human beings, we tend to think in binary cognitive distinctions. This is like a human universal, so just it's I guess it's something that we're just inclined to think according to.
Yeah, we need to simplify things down, but it also is just it kind of emerges out of that power struggle, right? The power struggle that's always going on generates two sides, and we need names for the two sides, and so left and right are about as good as any, and they are arbitrary, but in a way that's almost it's appropriate because there is a certain arbitrariness to those positions. Well, I guess we could end it there. I feel like we probably left a few things out.
Well, actually, one last thing I could mention was when I was looking through the article about the French Revolution, I read something about how the terms left and right, they were most often used pejoratively. So basically ways of distancing themselves from the other side. So I think this does kind of show that a lot of the left-right distinction, I mean, even if human behavior is a bit more complex, we also do tend to be tribal and divide down according to groups, and often those groups do tend to be generally two groups.
Politics is certainly tribal, and it's a way of you said this the last time we talked about this, that politics is war by other means, right?
Yeah.
So it's going to resemble war in that sense, that it's going to be a struggle between two opposing sides.
Yeah, I think that's very accurate.
All right, then, I guess we should just wrap it up. Good talking to you, as always.
Yeah, it's good talking to you too.